Donald Trump stooping to an ugly new low, even for him. He's making a claim that will be heard the world over, reviving an old and familiar and rather tired tactic of accusing a perceived political enemy of treason. Only this time, the subject was his first-term predecessor, former President Barack Obama.
The leader of the gang was President Obama. He's guilty. It's not a question. I like to say, let's give it time. It's there. He's guilty. This was treason. This was every word you can think of. They tried to steal the election.
He made that baseless, unsubstantiated, rather ludicrous accusation today in the Oval Office. It follows baseless, unsubstantiated claims from his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard said that President Obama's officials engaged in a, quote, seditious conspiracy and hid evidence that Russia did not interfere in the 2016 election. Donald Trump's claims today, an accusation of a crime that is punishable by death, so outrageous that they drew this rare rebuke from President Barack Obama's office. It reads, quote, out of respect for the office of the presidency, our office does not normally dignify the constant nonsense and misinformation flowing out of this White House with a response. But these claims are outrageous enough to merit one. These bizarre allegations are ridiculous and a weak attempt at distraction. Nothing in the document issued last week undercuts the widely accepted conclusion that Russia worked to influence the 2016 presidential election, but did not successfully manipulate any votes. These findings were affirmed in a 2020 report by the Bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, led by then-Chairman Marco Rubio. The very same Marco Rubio, little Marco to Donald, who currently serves as Trump's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. His report concluded that Russia conducted an influence campaign in 2016 to do this, quote, harm the Clinton campaign, tarnish an expected Clinton presidential administration, help the Trump campaign after Trump became the presumptive Republican nominee, and undermine the U.S. democratic process. That conclusion was further bolstered earlier this month when Donald Trump's current CIA director, a man named John Ratcliffe, released a review that, as NBC News points out, quote, did not refute the findings of the intelligence assessment that Russia sought to interfere in the election. Now, as for these wild and erratic and unfounded attempts by Tulsi Gabbard and Donald Trump to rewrite their own version of history and provide a distraction from the Jeffrey Epstein debacle that has completely engulfed Donald Trump and his White House. They are claiming that the Obama administration concealed evidence that Russia did not try to manipulate votes. But that's Orwellian doublespeak. It's not what Obama's officials ever claimed in the first instance. It was always about an influence campaign. Here was President Obama explaining it on December 16, 2016.
I can assure the public that there was not the kind of tampering with the voting process that was of concern and will continue to be of concern going forward, that the votes that were cast were counted. They were counted appropriately. We have not seen evidence of machines being tampered with. So that assurance I can provide.
That is where we start the hour with ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Also joining us, staff writer at The Atlantic and a contributor to The Atlantic Daily Newsletter, Tom Nichols is here. And former DHS Chief of Staff during Trump's first term, Miles Taylor, is back with us. Congressman, let me start with you, and let me show you one more piece of sound. This is Tulsi Gabbard echoing the very same thing that President Obama says in that tape I just played to Joe Rogan.
When you're talking about like these Russian troll farms that you mentioned, what is missing from all of the news coverage around this and all of the outrage about how this foreign country is trying to influence our elections, which is wrong and which the American people need to be aware of, where this information is coming from, is the fact that and you're saying, why does somebody do that? Well, because this country does want to influence who we're electing, right?
Yes.
Like, oh, we'd rather work with this person. We know that person is not going to be nice to us.
Congressman, your thoughts on this Rubicon crossing news cycle?
Well, that's a very different Tulsi Gabbard. That was Tulsi Gabbard before she was in the employ of Donald Trump and before she saw a political route to power and influence. And now, of course, we have a radically different Tulsi Gabbard. You didn't play, by the way, any sound of then Senator Marco Rubio, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who wrote and got a unanimous vote from Democrats and Republicans of an investigation of the Russian attack on the election, which, just as you have been saying, and just as you played Obama saying, did not involve technical messing around with voting equipment, but did involve hacking the DNC and releasing emails. It did involve buying social media ads in the service of something that Marco Rubio's report said, which is that the Russians tampered with the election, not through the technical means, in the service of Donald Trump. But of course, now that Marco Rubio and Tulsi Gabbard are working for Donald Trump, reality has been inverted. And what troubles me most about this, Nicole, is that I'm standing in a spot that on January 6, 2021 was overrun by a violent mob intent on hanging the vice president and killing people like me. And it was all driven by a lie propagated by Donald Trump. And now we're seeing that playbook again. And my only question is, when people like Tulsi Gabbard and Donald Trump accuse an ex-president of a capital crime that is punishable by death, who is going to die? Who is going to die because they've decided that they need a distraction away from the Epstein calamity, which they brought upon themselves?
Well, I mean, it's a dark place that we find ourselves in. And I think that Trump has led all of us to the underbelly of his movement's deepest passions by botching the Epstein file release that he promised his base so badly that we're all down in the rabbit hole with him, trying to understand how conspiracies drive his voters' passions. Say more about how we protect people targeted by his lies, and say more about your prediction that someone will die.
Well, again, when you use language like treason, and I mean, go into my social media feeds, because I've been trying to tell the truth about this ever since Tulsi put out this staggeringly disprovable and instantly disprovable lie. When you start using the kind of language, the language of treason and of somebody being a traitor, some tiny percentage of the population is just crazy enough to decide that they need to do something about it. And again, it's what happened where I am standing right now on January 6, 2021. The statements of a president have some power. And by the way, 4 weeks from now, or 5 weeks from now, or 6 weeks from now, we all need to ask the question, and I will certainly ask the question, which is, okay, the former president is a traitor. Where is the Department of Justice indictment? Where is the prosecution of Barack Obama? But it will be Epstein all over again, because 4 or 5 weeks from now, there will, of course, be no prosecution of a Barack Obama, because there's not a court in the land that would do anything other than laugh the DOJ and the prosecutors out of the room. But by then, we'll be on to the next bizarro conspiracy theory to try to distract from the fact that, no, they're not going to prosecute Barack Obama.
Let me show you. I mean, accusing someone of treason isn't new. Accusing a former President Obama, of treason is the twist. But here's a list of the people that Trump has smeared with accusations of treason. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, former FBI agent Pete Strzok, former FBI agent Lisa Page, and Miles Taylor, one of your fellow panelists. I mean, what they all have in common is putting the Constitution and national security ahead of any sort of fealty to Donald Trump. Are you positive that Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice won't invert that sort of paradigm and put Donald Trump ahead of the Constitution and national security and indict somebody or charge somebody without evidence?
They might try. That would be a terrifically foolish move, because the one element of our national government which has not bent its knee to pledge total fealty to Donald Trump is the judiciary. And judge after judge after judge, including Trump-appointed judges, are standing up and saying, and actually laughing stuff out of court. You know, the trial yesterday around the attack on Harvard University, the judges are using language that is almost comically derisive of the Department of Justice and of this administration. So maybe Pam Bondi, in a desperate attempt to keep her job, does in fact try to prosecute Barack Obama or Jim Himes or Mark Milley. And, you know, the laughter from whatever court that case is brought into will be heard in 4 time zones.
But his new plan to quell the tempest appears to be utilizing the government's existing leverage over Jeffrey Epstein's most notorious accomplice. That would be convicted child sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell. She was inseparable from Epstein for nearly 3 decades, and in that time, she reportedly procured and groomed the middle school and high school age girls that Epstein and Maxwell and others reportedly preyed on.
Virginia Roberts was working in the spa at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach when British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell introduced her to multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein.
The training started immediately. I mean, it was everything down to how to give a blowjob, how to be quiet, be subservient, give Jeffrey what he wants. A lot of this training came from Ghislaine herself. And being a woman, it kind of surprises you that a woman could actually let stuff like that happen, but not only let it happen, but to groom you into doing it.
That woman you heard from there, who changed her name to Virginia Giuffre, says she was 16 when Maxwell and Epstein began training her daily in one of Epstein's mansions to, quote, do what they wanted, including sexual activities and the use of sexual toys. At least 200 women have made similar accusations. Back in April, Giuffre died by suicide, but not before telling the Miami Herald how Ghislaine Maxwell tracked her down half a world away and demanded her silence.
And I get a phone call from Ghislaine one day in Australia. I'm in Australia. I was like, how the hell did she just find me? Like, I've been out of their life for so long. What's going on? She's like, have you talked to anybody? Have you told anybody what's happened? Like, you know, have you reported us or anything? And I said, no, I haven't spoken to anybody. Okay, good. You stay like that. You stay quiet.
You stay quiet. In 2022, 3 years after Epstein was arrested and killed himself, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted on 5 felony counts. She is currently serving 20 years and facing more criminal trials. And because Maxwell was Epstein's partner, she was also seen in multiple photographs at multiple events on multiple occasions with, of course, Donald Trump. In fact, when she was on trial without bail, this is what he said about her.
I'm wondering, do you feel that she's going to turn in powerful men? How do you see that working out?
I don't know. I haven't really been following it too much. I just wish her well, frankly. I've met her numerous times over the years, especially since I lived in Palm Beach, and I guess they lived in Palm Beach. But I wish her well, whatever it is.
Mr. President, Ghislaine Maxwell has been arrested on allegations of child sex trafficking. Why would you wish such a person well?
First of all, I don't know that, but I do know that
she has. She's been arrested for that. You know that.
Friend or boyfriend,
Epstein,
was either killed or committed suicide in jail. She's now in jail. Yeah, I wish her well. I'd wish you well. I'd wish a lot of people well. Good luck.
Given the chance to say anything about Ghislaine Maxwell, an actual groomer and abuser of children, Trump wished her well? That's the old one thing he had to say about this woman? Well, today you might have noticed her name popped up a bit again, big time, when Maxwell's own attorney confirmed they're in negotiations with the federal government. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who was Trump's defense attorney when he was convicted of 34 felony counts of fraud in New York, he is their main contact at DOJ. Today, Trump claimed he had nothing to do with it, but didn't seem to mind.
I don't know anything about it. They're going to what? Meet her?
They're going to, your Deputy Attorney General has reached out to Ghislaine Maxwell's attorney asking for a new interview.
Yeah, I don't know about it, but I think it's something that sounds appropriate to do, yeah.
Do you have any concern that your Deputy Attorney General, as your former attorney, would be conducting the interview, given...
No, I have no concern. He's a very talented person. He's very smart. I didn't know that they were going to do it. I don't really follow that too much.
He doesn't know about it. He just knows all the players. Now he's backed into a corner, and so his DOJ officials, led by his personal criminal lawyer, are negotiations with Epstein's accomplice, whose only hope for freedom might be a presidential pardon or clemency. Julia Carey Brown has been covering the Epstein story for years as an investigative reporter for the Miami Herald. Her reporting reignited interest in the Epstein case prior to his federal indictment. She's the author of Perversion of Justice, the Jeffrey Epstein Story, and she joins me now. Julie, what is your reaction to seeing the number two, I think, of the Department of Justice say that they're going to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell and find out what she knows?
Well, you have to wonder why they would immediately send someone of such high stature to investigate what she knows. Normally, as I understand from talking to prosecutors, federal prosecutors today, they wouldn't send the number two person to talk to her. They would send other people, to find out what she knows and then report back. The fact that not only that they sent the number two person in the Justice Department, but they also announced it. And so I'm curious, why would they have to announce it? It sort of reminds me of what Bondi did with the Epstein files to begin with, all over the news, Fox News saying, we're going to release them, we're going to do this. And it backfired. And you have to wonder why they would announce it and not just do it. I mean, they probably should have done it even before now.
I mean, it seems to me it's clear that Ghislaine Maxwell doesn't want to spend the rest of her life in prison. She doesn't want to serve the rest of her sentence. She has an appeal that she's trying to get taken up by the Supreme Court that essentially says that the deal made by Alex Acosta that you reported on makes it, should throw out her conviction. It does seem to me like maybe they're angling for a pardon and they're trying to essentially arrange some kind of deal between the two, basically between Maxwell and Trump.
Yeah, maybe it's the sweetheart deal 2.0. I mean, that's what the victims are concerned about. They think that this is all an effort for her to secure some kind of a sweetheart deal herself. I mean, this would be a travesty. In some ways, the victims feel that she was worse than Epstein because she was the one that brought them into this whole circle, this orbit of sex trafficking. She was the one that went to the spas around Palm Beach, started recruiting high school girls, even middle school girls, to give him Epstein, quote unquote, massages that we know weren't massages. So she was really the person that they view as the mastermind of his entire sex trafficking operation. So to make a deal with someone like that, it is really something that's going to, I think, upset a lot of people, especially the victims.
Yeah, we don't have any indication yet that that is what is being contemplated, other than this conversation happening at very, very high levels. Here's David Marcus, the attorney for Ghislaine Maxwell. I can confirm that we are in discussions with the government, that Ghislaine will always testify truthfully. We're grateful for President Trump for his commitment to uncovering the truth in this case. Of course, we should note that the Department of Justice itself, when prosecuting Maxwell back in 2020 in Donald Trump's Department of Justice, said the defendant's willingness to brazenly lie under oath about her conduct strongly suggests her true motive has been or remains to avoid being held accountable for her crimes. This is a person that the Justice Department prosecuted as a liar, who they're now throwing the doors open to for a high-level meeting to, quote, find out what she knows.
Yes. I was going to point that out. I mean, at one point that they charged her, I believe, with perjury. During her depositions in some of the cases, which she would, had to take an oath that she would tell the truth, she lied. And so one of the charges ended up being perjury against her. The other point I want to make is if part of her appeal is that she wants to be considered part of that original sweetheart deal where she was designated, or she says she was designated as a, quote, co-conspirator, that's essentially saying she was involved. So I don't know if you can have it both ways here,
Julie, I guess the last question for you is, we got this Wall Street Journal story, and, I found that document, which Trump says was, fabricated, not real, fake, he's suing over it, unnerving. We knew that the two men had a relationship, even a close relationship. there's a question of where did that come from? Was that, was it leaked by the Department of Justice? Did someone get their hands on it? I guess we don't know. I want to be clear. But one possible theory is that Maxwell, desperate for some sort of a pardon, is basically sending messages saying, I know stuff about you that can be very embarrassing, and that message was received. And I don't know if that's the case. I'm trying to make sense of the facts as we do know them, but I wonder how plausible that seems to you.
I mean, anything is possible with this story. It's hard to know exactly who's leaking who. There are other parties besides Maxwell whose names are contained in those Epstein files. So I'm sure that they're all working overtime to try to figure out a way that their names don't get out. So it wouldn't necessarily be just Maxwell. There would be other people that were involved in his sex trafficking operation. It could be doing the same thing.
Welcome back. We are following breaking news from Capitol Hill. Just in the last few minutes, a committee spokeswoman told NBC News the House Oversight Committee will subpoena Ghislaine Maxwell, quote, as expeditiously as possible. It comes after a motion to subpoena her passed in a subcommittee. It just passed in a subcommittee, I should say, just in the last hour. All this happening shortly after Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said he's seeking a meeting with Maxwell. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman Robert Garcia from California. He is the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. And Congressman, appointed time for you to be with us. The subpoena motion was offered by your Republican colleague, Congressman Tim Burchett. What's your reaction, and what do you think your colleagues want to learn from Ghislaine Maxwell?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's important first. Democrats actually voted unanimously with Republicans on this motion, and so it's bipartisan. I think what's important right now is that we get as much information on the Epstein files, what happened, who was involved, and Democrats support that, including, of course, as we know, some Republicans. We know, broadly speaking, though, Donald Trump is completely opposed to releasing the files. He's trying to divert. He's clearly hiding something. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is obviously also trying to hide something. She knows a lot of information. And so this is a piece of getting more information, but not the complete picture. I also want to add, I think it's really important that Ghislaine we're happy to have her subpoena and have her come in front of our committee. But let's be clear, this is not a good person. This is also someone that's been convicted of serious sex trafficking crimes. She's serving time. She likely wants a pardon herself. And so that does complicate this process. But we do think it's important to hear from her. And so that's why we decided to move forward.
So to that point, is it important to you to have Ghislaine Maxwell brought before Congress to testify? What's the end game here?
Look, the end game here is we want a complete release of the Epstein files. We want it declassified, and we don't want those files to be protecting anyone, and certainly not the President of the United States. And so that is an important piece of this. But more broadly speaking, we know, as the Attorney General has said, they have the full Epstein files. There are actual written documents. There are videos in those files. There's an enormous amount of information we understand. And what's really concerning, and which concern the American public, is why Donald Trump has done a complete turnaround. Now that he actually had the power to release the files, he is choosing not to. And not just essentially stepping back. He's attacking people that are calling for the release of the files, including people of his own base. And so this should alarm the entire country, including those that supported him. They feel betrayed. Democrats, we're going to fight every single day to ensure that the truth comes out. And if that means putting out subpoenas, if that means ensuring that we go to court to get documents, we're going to do everything we can in our power to do so.
You have said, and you're just saying again, that we should keep up the pressure on the administration to release the Epstein files. Are you at all worried about what may be in those files when it comes to Democrats, or is this an altruistic effort to try to just get as much information to the public as possible?
I'm not concerned. Because at the end of the day, if you are sexually abusing young women, if you are committing crimes, if you are then somehow using that for political influence, everyone should be held accountable. And so what we want is a full release of the files, regardless of who is impacted. Powerful people with money, should not have the opportunity to abuse people in this country, particularly not abuse young women. And so we need to ensure that those files are fully released to the public. And what's really important here is right now Donald Trump is supporting, we know, eliminating health care for millions of Americans. He's not addressing the cost of goods and lowering them. He's not taking on the problems of the American public. And while he's making things worse for working people, he's betraying his base and he's lying to the American public. So now we know that not only will Donald Trump not actually help you and your family, he's going to lie to you, he's going to betray to you, and he's going to turn his back on the very people that voted for him. And that's at the heart of what the Epstein files is about. It's not just about doing the right thing in transparency. This is clearly about also Donald Trump's betrayal to his very own supporters.
We just learned that the House has canceled votes and will actually go into recess early tomorrow. It appears that it may be in part an effort to avoid these Epstein motions. Here's what House Speaker Mike Johnson had to say.
What we refuse to do is participate in another one of the Democrats' political games. This is a serious matter. We are not going to let them use this as a political battering ram. They don't have any moral high ground on this at all. They controlled the Department of Justice for the last 4 years. Has anyone forgotten? They had all these files the entire time. They sat on everything Epstein related for 4 long years while President Biden was in office.
So, Congressman, what's your reaction to that? Did Democrats sit on this information?
Look, the Epstein file issue, as we know, was their issue. We've always allowed the Department of Justice to do their work. They should be separate, as we know, in many ways from the executive branch. We know now that Donald Trump has essentially inserted himself to all the decisions that the DOJ actually does. And Mike Johnson is cowardly in that response. He literally has cut our session short, where we could be working on how to address the lowering the costs for the American public. And he's cutting it short because he does not want to answer questions about the Epstein files. He does not want his members voting to release the files. And so there's only one party here that's scared of this release, and that's clearly the Republicans and Donald Trump. We say release the files, bring the vote to the House floor right now for a full release, for declassification. There is nothing to hide, and we should not be scared of that full release.
Congressman, when it comes to Deputy AG Todd Blanche, Trump's former personal attorney, he wants to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell. Do you agree with that? Is that a good idea?
Look, I think this is where we've got to be a little bit concerned. There is no question that she is right now serving for horrific crimes, for sex trafficking, for all the abuse, for being a partner to Jeffrey Epstein. And so she is not a good person. And at the same time, Trump is now injecting himself there, which I think should cause us some concern, knowing that she probably very well wants a pardon from Donald Trump. And so, while it's important certainly to hear from her, and I think that she should do so in front of the committee, I think these kind of conversations that Trump is trying to have with her directly should cause us some concern, and we'll be monitoring it very closely.
And a lot of people will be wondering whether a deal could be in the making for her. Congressman Robert Garcia, thank you so much for your time.
Stephen Colbert is refusing to back down after news broke that CBS would be canceling The Late Show in May of 2026. The host is one of the most watched shows in late night TV, taking aim at Donald Trump, plus skewering CBS and Paramount for its $16 million settlement with Trump.
Over the weekend, somebody at CBS followed up their gracious press release with a gracious anonymous leak saying they pulled the plug on our show because of losses pegged between $40 million and $50 million a year. $40 million's a big number. I could see us losing $24 million, but where would Paramount have possibly spent the other $16 million? Oh, yeah.
And other late night hosts across networks are backing Colbert. Here's Jon Stewart's take.
So here's the point. If you're trying to figure out why Stephen's show is ending, I don't think the answer can be found in some smoking gun email or phone call from Trump to CBS executives or in CBS's QuickBooks spreadsheets on the financial health of late night. I think the answer is in the fear and pre-compliance that is gripping all of America's institutions at this very moment. Institutions that have chosen not to fight the vengeful and vindictive actions of our pubic hair doodling commander-in-chief. This is not the moment to give in.
CBS and Paramount insist the cancellation was financially motivated, but many are, of course, skeptical. Senator Ed Markey asking Paramount if the Trump administration is using its regulatory authority to influence or otherwise pressure your company's editorial decisions. Similarly, 3 other Democratic senators asking the head of Skydance Media about Trump's claims about a side deal Today, Trump claiming that, quote, we also anticipate receiving $20 million more from the new owners in advertising, PSAs, or similar programming. Joining me now is Angelo Carusone, president of Media Matters for America. Angelo, is Jon Stewart right about the dangers of pre-compliance by corporations when it comes to Trump?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, power perceived is power achieved. So even if the FCC didn't make it hard and firm conditions for this deal to go through, in a weird way, that's even worse, because it meant that that Paramount and Skydance went above and beyond what they needed to do, that they went even further than was required of them to demonstrate their fealty so that they could get approval. And you can criticize them, and then you can then think about the larger downstream effects here, because if they're doing that, it starts to create that this is now the way that business gets done. It's the same way that corruption is like a poison, and it seeps out and takes everything over. So I think that's the right way to think about it. We don't have to jump to conclusions. We don't have to make assumptions, although there's a lot of evidence to show that the timing here doesn't work out, doesn't line up. But I think ultimately the pre-compliance is a big piece. And then the other part that I would just add to Jon Stewart is performance. Because I would just note that this became public the same week, within just a few days, that David Ellison made filings and commitments to the FCC promising that when the deal goes through, that his new company will have a diversity of opinion. And I think they wanted this out there publicly, because this decision was made several weeks ago, as we know. But they wanted that to be known publicly at the same time that he made those promises to the FCC, because it helps reinforce that claim. It's performative. So pre-compliance and performance.
It also seems like, in a way, Trump is kind of giving the game away online as he posts through this whole thing by saying and hinting he hopes to see other late night hosts fired soon. But then also this Truth Social post where he says basically that the total is $36 million, not the original $16 million. And then what we still don't know a lot about here, which is that this is apparently about public service announcements and advertising. I guess we're left to assume for conservative causes. Did that surprise you when we heard this? And what did it signal to you?
No, because that I think is very consistent, because I think that the thing to put in context here is that what we're talking about in terms of the federal government using heavy-handed tactics to apply pressure to a deal, because even if they didn't do it with Colbert, they for sure did it with the settlement. I mean, Trump himself said that back in June, that he thought that David Ellison would be a great owner, but one of the things holding up the merger was this CBS thing that needed to get resolved regarding the lawsuit. So, I mean, he basically gave it away. But what doesn't surprise me about this sweetener is that in every industry where the Trump administration is applying government power to try to break them, and I think we saw this a lot in the legal community, they wanted these sweeteners. It wasn't enough that these entities caved, right? That the law firm said, we're going to give you everything you asked for. They had to give them free pro bono work too, to support Trump administration causes. And that is the same thing we're seeing play out right now in some of these higher education fights, where not only are they willing to give Trump everything he's asking for, some of the schools, in terms of their policy changes, but they're also they're apparently going to have to pay some kind of money in addition to that, which is absolutely wild.
Quickly, I'm curious if you think now that comedians are seeing all this play out, if we're going to see them feel like they have nothing to lose. I mean, Colbert is going to be on the air for months more. So are we going to get the same Colbert, or are people going to scale back and start to self-censor, in your view?
I don't think the individuals are going to scale back. I think, in fact, this only, especially comedians. One of the things in history is that comedians used to be the truth tellers. I mean, that was in when you had kings and queens. One of the few people that could actually tell the truth and not get killed were the jesters. That's why they existed. That has been a part of comedians throughout history. And so I think this is only going to inspire them to be more, sharp in their critiques and their satire. But I think what's scarier for me is that while those individuals are doing things, and they matter, and they help demonstrate some resilience in free speech, I think that this practice and pattern at these big institutional levels is actually only going to accelerate. There have seen not any meaningful speed bumps, and the FCC is one of many agencies, and they're just getting started when it comes to these deals.
And joining us now, NBC News national law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter, NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, NBC News chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, and Puck's chief Washington correspondent, familiar face around here, Leanne Caldwell. Tom, one thing I left out of that just now was the news about Todd Blanche visiting Ghislaine Maxwell in prison. What is he doing there?
Right. So this is something that's going to be set up, according to statement not only from the Deputy Attorney General, but also from Maxwell's own attorneys who acknowledged that this contact has occurred and that it appears that initially they're going to have a discussion, just Blanche and the attorneys, and then from there they're going to have a discussion, Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell. What they're going to get out of that, I'm not so sure. I mean, Epstein's been dead for almost 6 years now. The anniversary of his death is coming up in the next couple of weeks. And then as far as Maxwell, you know, we had a trial and I was in the hearing when Maxwell, the topic of a plea agreement came up. The judge asked the prosecution, said, has there been a plea offer in this case? They said no. And they said, in fact, neither has Maxwell requested one. So there was an opportunity there. I mean, if she had requested one, if she had other information. But I think at the time, as we reported it at the time, Katie, there was not really a compelling case for cooperation because investigators believed that they had maxed out all other avenues as far as additional prosecutions and that there was nothing really there for her to offer prosecutors in terms of cooperation. But I got to say something. We've seen tweets and statements and posts about going to visit Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, in front of my name, it doesn't say detective. It doesn't say special agent, but I've been doing this job long enough, focused on law enforcement, to know that when you have victims, one of the things that you might do if you're going to go back and look at a case is to go back and speak to the victims. We have not heard about that. We've seen no statement about that from the Justice Department. And our colleague, Laura Strickler, just in the past hour, reached one of the attorneys for about 20 of the victims in the Epstein case, says they've never been contacted by anybody in federal law enforcement over the course of the last several months pertaining to this review. So it's really difficult for me to understand what is it exactly that Maxwell's going to offer that a group of victims who have, according to civil testimony, according to the testimony in federal court that convicted Maxwell, have testified credibly about what they say happened in the course of the years with Epstein and Maxwell. Why not go back and speak to them if you're going to try to see if there's anything to advance in the case?
Maxwell had something to offer for a plea agreement. Say she had knowledge of interactions that other powerful people had or wrongdoing that other powerful people committed. Wouldn't she offer that as part of a plea deal?
Exactly. I mean,
what is the conspiracy that she didn't because she was worried about her own safety? These are very, very powerful people.
I mean, at that point, if she had said, look, I did this sex trafficking, purely as a hypothetical, I was involved in this whole thing. But what you guys aren't focusing on is high-profile person A, high-profile person B, high-profile person C, then that clearly would have been of interest for investigators, and that might have been worth a discussion. But that never happened. We've never heard about it in her filings. Her attorneys have never represented that. So where was this discussion before?
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they're going to come out with after this conversation, if anything.
But the thing is, though, Katie, on the victims, why not reach out to the victims? At the very least, tell them, here are the steps that we're going to do for you if there is another avenue for justice. That's the Justice Department's job. That's the very reason we got into this in the first place. There were a number of victims that sued the Justice Department saying you violated our rights as crime victims in this plea agreement.
So
the reason why we're here in the first
is what's
place.
happening right now, this idea that Maxwell is somehow the victim? Is she being painted as a victim in some circles? I'm having a hard time following the conspiracy and who's arguing what lately.
Well, I have a hard time following it, too, and I've covered this case for only about 10 years. So I'm not sure exactly what the thought process is. What I am sure about is there doesn't seem to be any indication publicly and from our discussion with at least one attorney of anybody picking up the phone and calling and caring about the victims in this case who have obviously been let down by the Justice Department in the past.
The ones who were taken advantage of and violated. All right, Ryan, let me ask you about Congress. What happened? Why is the Speaker sending everybody home early for their summer break?
Well, the biggest reason is, Katie, because he does not have unanimity within his own conference as to how to push forward as it relates to the revealing of information in this controversy. House Speaker Mike Johnson told us today, Leanne and I were both in the room when this happened, that there's no daylight between him and President Trump when it comes to what he described as transparency in this case, and he blamed Democrats for being the obstructionists in this. But that really flies in the face of the facts that it is Republicans that control the Rules Committee. They have a 9-4 advantage on the Rules Committee. If they wanted to dispatch or get rid of any amendment having to do with Jeffrey Epstein, they could do so. The reason they can't do it is because there are rank and file members of the House Republican Conference who do not believe the Trump administration has gone far enough in revealing information as it relates to this case. And you see the House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer echoing that sentiment. So the House Speaker can try and push this off. He can claim that it's Democrats that are responsible for all of it, but it's his own party that he has a problem with here. And if this was something that Republicans were completely unified on, he could bring a bill to the floor. They have the majority of the votes. They could either motion to table it or get it out of the way and not talk about it. He simply does not have that ability right now, which is why he's basically putting up the out of office sign on the House chamber doors and saying, we're going on our recess so that we don't have to talk about this for a month. The question is, what's going to happen when they come back? You heard Marjorie Taylor Greene say that this is the #1 constituent call issue that she's dealing with in her ruby red district. Is that what it's going to be like when they go back and talk to their constituents in these towns across the country? Are they going to get an earful from their voters because they're not doing enough on this? I think Republicans have tried to bury their heads in the sand for quite some time since the DOJ released that initial memo saying there's nothing to see here. It's clear it is their base that is upset about this. Yeah. There's no doubt that Democrats are trying to exacerbate that. I'm not going to deny that in any way, shape, or form. Democrats are picking at a scab for sure, but the problem exists within the Republican conference.
Yeah, Leanne, you saw that. You saw Thomas Massie holding up that binder. You know, if you build it, they will come. If you have the binder, you will get the information. How pervasive is the issue of Epstein? Is it just a Washington thing? Is it just Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie demanding this? Or is it that Marjorie Taylor Greene is right, that this is the #1 call from her constituents, and that other lawmakers are feeling that as well, that the base, their voters, are the ones that are loudly demanding this?
Yeah, it's a question I keep asking these members because I'm trying to figure out the same thing, Katie. And when I talked to Marjorie Taylor Greene today, she said that this will absolutely be a political issue for Republicans, too, in the 2026 midterm elections. And she believes because so many of Republican-based voters care about this way too much if this is not handled correctly. And part of the reason, or a big reason, the House Rules Committee was so stuck, as Ryan mentioned, because Republicans did not want to vote over and over again against releasing this information. They didn't want to vote for a Democratic amendment, but they also didn't want to vote against releasing the information because they, I'm told, are being hammered by their constituents at home too. And not all of those Rules Committee members are from really, really conservative districts. There's some more moderate members on there. And so this does seem to be an issue that is not going away. Remember, part of the MAGA coalition was built in large part because Trump is a truth teller. He was the one who was going to break the deep state. And Republicans signed on to that and agreed with them and got behind him on that. And so now their constituents are expecting them to act.
Yeah. And he installed a bunch of folks who were not a part of the deep state, notably saying that these are the people that report to me and me alone. They're not established, institutionalized individuals like Kash Patel and Pam Bondi, et cetera. He purposefully chose people who were loyal to him. Vaughn Hilliard, how much is this rattling the White House?
Well, the president suggested from the Oval Office that he wasn't aware that the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General were going to go forward with this Ghislaine Maxwell meeting or seek to have a discussion with her, which I think is notable if you take the president's word in this here. He is effectively called this a witch hunt, as he did during that exact same Oval Office meeting. It's not clear what part of this all he's referring to as a witch hunt, because we know that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were both found found guilty of sex trafficking and assault charges. And if you go back to 2020, it was the Department of Justice under his first Trump administration that brought that first indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell and ultimately was effectively able to prosecute her and sentence her to 20 years in prison. She, if she were to get out after 20 years, would be 80 years old here. And folks will recall back in 2020, shortly after that indictment was handed down against Ghislaine Maxwell, the then president was asked about it, and he wished her well and noted that he had met her numerous times, especially because of their shared Palm Beach residences. And I think if you look at this a step further, also the potential conflict of interest that Todd Blanche, his former defense attorney up until a couple months ago and becoming the #2 at the Department of Justice, is the one who is going to be having conversations potentially with Ghislaine Maxwell. And the president was asked specifically whether he had concerns about the dynamic of that relationship, and he said no. He called his former personal defense attorney a smart man there. But I think this really hits at the heart of the conflict of interest question, and one that, you know, we learned a lot from the extensive reporting that Tom did at the time of her trial. One of those tidbits that came out about Donald Trump were those flight logs showing that he went on 7 different flights, according to the flight records from Ghislaine Maxwell. And so I think that there's a lot of questions here, and it's notable that the man who is leading this discussion is somebody who is defending the very man who is named in the Epstein files here at the same time.